Europe just hit its strongest quarterly growth since 2023. That sounds like great news, right? Here's the problem. It's January 2026, and those numbers are already in the rearview mirror. While economists celebrate that 0.3% figure, they're ignoring what's coming next. Tariff wars are brewing, manufacturing is collapsing, and the growth they're celebrating might be nothing more than an accounting trick. Let that sink in. The numbers behind that growth tell a very different story. When Europe's statisticians released that 0.3% quarterly figure, they buried the real details in footnotes and technical reports. Ireland's economy created a massive distortion. Irish companies rushed to export goods before expected US tariffs hit. They front-loaded billions in trade, artificially boosting the entire Eurozone's numbers. But here's what the headlines won't tell you. That same Irish boost is already fading. By the fourth quarter of 2025, Ireland's economy contracted, dragging down the very statistic that made everyone celebrate. The European Central Bank's own data shows this clearly. They call it a sharp unwinding that declined by much less than expected. That's economists speak for "we got lucky it wasn't worse." Strip away Ireland's accounting games, and you're left with an economy growing at barely 0.2% quarterly. That's not a recovery. That's stagnation dressed up with statistical makeup. The services sector is carrying the entire continent while manufacturing continues to weaken. Business confidence might be improving, but it's still below average levels. This pattern reveals something uncomfortable about Europe's economic reality. The continent isn't experiencing uniform growth, it's splitting apart. While politicians celebrate average statistics, entire regions are moving in opposite directions. Some countries are genuinely thriving, others are sliding backwards. And the external threats that could derail everything are already gathering on the horizon. The cracks in Europe's economic foundation run much deeper than any quarterly statistic can reveal. While the Eurozone celebrated that 0.3% growth figure, the continent was quietly fracturing along national lines. This isn't the story of European recovery. This is the story of European divergence. Poland's economy is booming at 3.3% growth in 2025, with forecasts showing it will hit 3.4% in 2026. That's not a typo. While the Eurozone average crawls forward, Poland is experiencing genuine expansion driven by rising incomes, fiscal spending, and robust investment. Spanish households are driving their economy to 2.8% growth through solid spending and tourism rebounds. These aren't marginal improvements. They're complete reversals of the crisis narrative. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable for Brussels bureaucrats. The economic engine of Europe is sputtering. Germany, the continent's industrial powerhouse, is struggling with weak export demand and manufacturing decline. Italy is crawling along at barely 0.5% growth. The United Kingdom, even outside the EU, is slowing from 1.2% to just 1.0% as inflation and trade disruptions bite deeper. Let that sink in. The countries that were supposed to lead Europe's recovery are lagging behind nations that were written off just years ago. Poland is outgrowing Germany by a factor of 6. Spain is outperforming Italy by 5-1. The economic map of Europe has been redrawn, and the new winners aren't the ones sitting in the most important meetings. This divergence isn't accidental. It's structural. Poland's growth comes from domestic demand and strategic EU fund deployment. Spain benefits from tourism recovery and immigration-driven population growth. Meanwhile, Germany and France face the exact challenges that make them vulnerable to what's coming next. Their economies depend heavily on exports, particularly to markets that are about to become much more hostile. The manufacturing sector across core Europe is already contracting while services barely hold the line. The services PMI hit 52.8 in November 2025. Technically expansion, but weak by historical standards. Factory output continues declining as global supply chains reorganize away from European production. This isn't temporary adjustment pain. This is structural realignment happening in real time. European business leaders are sensing the shift. The economic sentiment indicator reached its highest level since April 2023. But that sounds better than it actually is. Confidence has been rising for 4 months straight, yet it remains below average levels. Business owners are cautiously optimistic about domestic demand while privately worried about export markets. They're reading the same trade policy signals that should terrify anyone paying attention. The Eurozone's growth story is really two different stories happening simultaneously. Domestic demand is holding up reasonably well as real wages recover and government spending increases. But external demand is weakening as trade tensions escalate and global supply chains restructure. Europe is becoming more dependent on internal consumption just as external threats to that consumption are multiplying. This economic split reveals a deeper truth about the European project. The promise of convergence, of lifting all boats together, is failing in practice. Instead of uniform prosperity, Europe is producing winners and losers at an accelerating pace. The political implications of this divergence haven't been fully felt yet, but they're building pressure beneath the surface of those averaged statistics. The countries thriving today are the ones least exposed to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Poland's domestic focus and Spain's service-based growth offer some protection from what's coming. But Germany's export dependence and Italy's structural weaknesses make them sitting ducks for the external shocks already taking aim at European prosperity. What makes this divergence particularly dangerous is its timing. Just as Europe splits into economic winners and losers, external pressures are mounting that could shatter the entire system. The trade policies emerging from Washington represent a fundamental threat to the export-dependent model that built European prosperity. And those threats aren't theoretical anymore. They're policy reality taking shape in real time. The growth celebration of late 2025 is starting to look like whistling past the graveyard. While economists focused on quarterly statistics, the global economic order that made European growth possible was already changing. The question isn't whether Europe can maintain that 0.3% quarterly pace. The question is whether any of these growth figures will matter once the external storm hits with full force. Trade wars don't announce themselves with fanfare. They build gradually through policy signals, tariff threats, and supply chain adjustments. European exporters are already feeling the pressure as protectionist policies gain momentum across the Atlantic. The phrase protectionist trade policies challenge export-dependent countries might sound academic, but it translates to job losses and factory closures in the real world. The timing couldn't be worse. Just as Europe's economy shows signs of internal fracture, it faces external pressures that will test every weakness in the system. The countries celebrating growth today might find themselves defending market share tomorrow. And the averaging statistics that made 2025 look successful will mean nothing if 2026 becomes a year of economic siege warfare. This is where the optimistic headlines meet harsh reality. Europe's strongest growth since 2023 is happening at the exact moment when the foundation for future growth is being systematically undermined. The celebration is premature. The real test is just beginning. And the external forces gathering strength have the power to turn today's growth statistics into tomorrow's economic obituaries. The storm clouds gathering over Europe aren't just metaphorical. They're policy reality taking shape in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. While European economists celebrated their quarterly statistics, the global trade system that made those numbers possible was already under attack. The Trump administration's return to power in 2025 brought immediate threats of comprehensive tariffs on European goods. This isn't political theater. It's economic warfare targeting the exact sectors where Europe remains vulnerable. German automotive exports, French luxury goods, Italian manufacturing all face potential tariff walls that could reshape decades of trade relationships overnight. German and French exporters are already sounding alarms about protectionist trade policies that challenge export-dependent countries. That diplomatic language translates to factories closing and workers losing jobs. The countries that struggled most with the divergence we just examined are also the most exposed to this external assault. It's like watching someone with a broken leg try to outrun an avalanche. Manufacturing across the Eurozone is contracting while services barely maintain expansion. The services PMI of 52.8 represents technical growth, but it's weak by historical standards. More importantly, it reveals Europe's dangerous dependence on domestic consumption just as external demand collapses. The continent is retreating into economic isolation whether it wants to or not. China's economic slowdown adds another layer of pressure. European exports to China have been declining as Beijing focuses on domestic production and reduces import dependence. The dual threat of American tariffs and Chinese self-sufficiency creates a perfect storm for European manufacturers who built their business models on global market access. But trade wars are just the lightning. The thunder is a slower, older problem Europe never fixed. Demographics don't care about quarterly statistics or political promises. The working-age population across the Eurozone is shrinking, and immigration can't fill the gap fast enough to maintain current productivity levels. Poland's current boom will face this demographic wall within a decade. Spain's immigration-driven growth comes with social tensions that could explode into political crisis. Germany's aging workforce makes its export dependence even more precarious. The countries celebrating today are borrowing prosperity from a future that looks increasingly bleak. The European Central Bank knows this. Their projections already assume slower growth ahead, but they're being diplomatic about the reasons. When central bankers start talking about productivity challenges and structural headwinds, they're preparing markets for disappointment without causing panic. Investment flows are already shifting away from European manufacturing towards service sectors and domestic infrastructure. That sounds like smart adaptation, until you realize it means abandoning the industrial base that made European prosperity possible. The continent is managing decline rather than planning growth. Geopolitical tensions add the final layer of uncertainty. Energy security remains fragile despite diversification efforts. Supply chain vulnerabilities persist across critical sectors. The war in Ukraine continues draining resources and attention from economic development. Europe is trying to grow while simultaneously preparing for conflict. These external pressures interact with the internal divergence in dangerous ways. Countries like Poland and Spain might weather initial shocks, but they're still part of an integrated system. When Germany's economy contracts, it doesn't just hurt Germans. It reduces demand for Polish goods and Spanish services. The Eurozone's interconnection becomes a transmission mechanism for economic pain. Currency pressures compound every other problem. The euro faces conflicting demands from strong economies like Poland and weak ones like Italy. Monetary policy that helps Germany might hurt Spain, and vice versa. The European Central Bank is managing an impossible balancing act, while external forces try to knock the whole system over. Financial markets are already pricing in these risks. Bond spreads between strong and weak European countries are widening again. Investment flows favor domestic over international projects. Currency hedging costs are rising as traders prepare for volatility. The celebration of 2025's growth is happening while smart money prepares for 2026's contraction. The confluence of internal divergence and external pressure creates a feedback loop of weakness. Countries struggling with domestic challenges become more vulnerable to external shocks. External pressures amplify internal divisions. Europe enters 2026 facing a crisis of confidence disguised as statistical success. So with these cracks inside and storms outside, what do the people in charge actually see coming next? The forecast is a reality check that no amount of statistical manipulation can disguise. The strongest growth since 2023 is about to become the last celebration before a very different kind of reality takes hold. The official forecast for 2026 tell the story European politicians don't want to discuss publicly. The European Central Bank projects Eurozone GDP growth of just 1.2% for 2026, down from the 1.4% they're celebrating for 2025. The Conference Board agrees, seeing growth slowing to 1.2% as external pressures overwhelm domestic resilience. These aren't pessimistic outliers, they're consensus reality. That 1.2% figure represents the best-case scenario where trade tensions remain manageable and geopolitical crises don't escalate. It assumes European consumers continue spending despite rising costs and job uncertainty. It assumes businesses keep investing despite regulatory uncertainty and market volatility. Every assumption depends on things getting better, not worse. The medium-term outlook extends this pattern of managed decline. European Commission forecasters project EU GDP growth of 1.5% by 2027, barely above the demographic death spiral. Spain drops to 1.5 to 1.6% growth as tourism normalizes and immigration pressures mount. Italy crawls toward 1.0% if everything goes perfectly. Even Poland's boom economy slows after 2026 as fiscal stimulus fades and demographic realities bite. These forecasts assume competent policy responses to external shocks. They assume European unity in the face of American trade pressure. They assume China doesn't accelerate its import substitution. They assume energy prices remain stable and supply chains adapt smoothly. Every assumption depends on factors beyond European control. The productivity challenge underlying these modest forecasts reveals Europe's deeper structural problem. Growth increasingly depends on hiring more workers rather than making existing workers more productive. That's not sustainable when the working-age population is shrinking and immigration creates social tension. Europe is running faster just to stay in the same place. Manufacturing's continued weakness means Europe is losing its competitive advantage in the sectors that built its prosperity. Services can sustain employment but not export earnings. Tourism and financial services can't replace industrial production as drivers of long-term growth. The continent is slowly becoming an economic museum of its former capabilities. The divergence patterns we examined will likely accelerate through 2026 and beyond. Countries with domestic-focused economies and younger populations will outperform export-dependent aging societies. But even the winners face constraints as the overall European market shrinks and external pressures intensify. Success becomes relative in a system under siege. Currency volatility adds another layer of uncertainty to every forecast. The euro faces pressure from divergent economic performance and conflicting policy needs. A stronger euro helps fight inflation but hurts exports. A weaker euro boosts competitiveness but increases import costs. There's no optimal exchange rate for an economy pulling itself apart. Financial system stability depends on continued confidence in European institutions and economic coordination. Rising bond spreads and banking sector stress could trigger a crisis that makes all growth forecasts irrelevant. The financial architecture that enabled European integration becomes a vulnerability when integration starts failing. The political implications of sustained low growth and continued divergence haven't been fully priced into these economic forecasts. Frustrated populations don't vote for more of the same. They vote for radical change, even when that change threatens the economic cooperation that made modest growth possible. Politics could accelerate the economic decline that forecasters assume will remain gradual. What comes next isn't collapse or recovery. It's a slow-motion adjustment to a new reality where European prosperity can't be taken for granted. The strongest growth since 2023 marks the end of crisis management and the beginning of permanent adaptation to reduced circumstances. The celebration was premature. The real work is just beginning. This is the reality they aren't explaining in the headlines. While politicians celebrate quarterly statistics, the long-term trajectory points toward managed decline disguised as stability. The external pressures are real, the internal divisions are widening, and the forecasts assume everything goes right. That's not how reality works. That's not how economics works. And if you want the complex truth instead of the simple headline, if you want to understand what's really coming next instead of what they want you to believe, you're in the right place. Subscribe to continue following this story as it unfolds, because the next chapter in Europe's economic transformation is going to be far more revealing than anything we've seen so far.